Set championships are right around the corner. And sometimes, if you're like me, you like to play off meta decks at set championships. Definitely in a world where we're not necessarily preparing for a DLC or preparing for a big tournament coming up, and we're just looking to have fun. I think this week we had several decks that came out from meta analysis from the last several weeks that have showed there are some really cool off meta decks that you could look at and be interested in Disney Lorcana. So, with that, let's get into them. So this was the week 7 and 8 breakdown, and you can see at the end of the line there, you have Emerald Sapphire, Sapphire Steel, Amethyst, Sapphire Control, Emerald Steel midrange, which I know, you probably are like, hey, that's not off meta, but in this day and age, it is. Nonetheless, there's some really cool decks to kind of look at, and when you look at the grand scope of this, like, yeah, of course, they're not the most successful or proven decks, but they're also probably the least played decks. So you never know that what you can find when you're looking through data and trying to find something new and interesting, and definitely something that can catch people off guard at set championships. Let's check out some of those deck lists. Sapphire Steel Wheel picked up a top 8 at a 47 player event this past weekend, and this is a pretty run of the mill Sapphire Steel wheel deck. And there are some new Ezreite C cards that, of course, are pretty good, but we haven't gotten a lot of love just yet. Jim Hawkins is the notable one here, the 2 cost 04 with 1 lore, and of course, the ability of whenever you ink, you get to give him Challenger +2. And yes, this does stack multiple times. So in a turn, if you have a Jim Hawkins on 2, on turn 3, you can ink a card. You could play a Sal the Azurite Sea, ink a second card. All of a sudden, your Jim Hawkins is a 4 strength, which I think is pretty cool. The other thing that you can do, not probably as necessary, but it is a nice little thing to understand, is that when you shift onto Jim Hawkins Rigging Specialist, the 5 cost 5/5 with 2 lore, shift 3, and the ability of battle stations, when you play this character, you may deal 1 damage to chosen character or location. In the turn, if you had already inked for your turn, your Jim Hawkins previously got Challenger 2. That effect does go through, so all of a sudden your now Jim Hawkins Rigging Specialist could be a 7/5 if necessary. Again, probably not a bit unnecessary, but it is notable to say that this is a possible line when utilizing this character. Aside from that, this is a pretty straightforward, Sapphire Steel wheel deck. I do think this deck has some position in the format. If your meta is a little more aggressive, sometimes set championships really do end up being like more aggressive, less high level competitive players and more casual. And a lot of times you do have aggro decks running around, whether it be Amber Amethyst aggro, even Amber Steel aggro, Emerald Amethyst aggro, like all those things are kind of like really common to me in set championships from my experience. So a deck like this that's like hosting multiple shift lines, multiple ways to interact with characters early, with fire the cannons, grab your swords, all of those things really kind of just start to add up, and you start to understand like, hey, this deck is probably really good. Even a card like Cogsworth that is not necessarily in this deck list is a card that is really good in against aggressive matchups, because it just means you get even more out of your character. So if you're just looking to say, hey, I want to find a way. I'm sorry, actually, Cogsworth was there. Guy was missing. I was trying to find him in the deck list, but he's there too. It's another card that's really, really good. So if you're looking just to see, hey, I haven't played in a while, or I'm kind of bored of like playing the norm. I've been testing way too hard for LCQs and things like that, and you just want to do something different. I think this is a really interesting way to kind of start the meta game, do a little something different, do a little bit off meta, and also kind of understand that your local meta game and the players that come to this are not necessarily as high level competitive, and they're probably playing a more low to the ground, easier decks to play, and this deck definitely preys on them. Jafar makes a return. This was played by Roger in the top 8 of the SSG 94 player tournament over the holiday weekend in between Christmas and New Year's. And, this deck actually had a couple games on stream. Sadly, he was unsuccessful in those games on stream. But again, you can see that Jim Hawkins, the Wriggling Specialist, is making an appearance here. This deck is the epitome of our shifting characters are fun. We have Jafars, Robin Hoods, Jim Hawkins, and even Aladdin. The one thing I think is most interesting about this list is Aladdin on 1, shift into the Floodborn Aladdin is a play that, I'll be honest, I would never expect, and my opponent would get me on it. every single time. So when I look at this list and I see that we have 4 library and I see that we have a Bayou, I would really be interested in maybe buying into a couple more locations in this list. I'm not exactly sure which ones I would, favor over another, but it's definitely a concept of saying, you know what, having a 3/3 on 2 that can shift and sing cards like, Let the Storm Rage on immediately. It's not Diablo, but it is similar, and these cards are both inkable, so we're not stuck with like off meta cards in hand and things like that. But when you also follow it with a turn 2 Blue Fairy, well, then you got something going on there. On turn 2, we can play Blue Fairy, we can shift Aladdin, draw our card back immediately from discarding our location, and then sing with the Aladdin, Let the Storm Rage on, and take out a character. It is noticeable. Obviously, you can also play Strength of a Raging Fighter here too if you really want to go that far in. I don't know how deep you can go, but I think it's just an interesting concept that people will not expect whatsoever in set championships. And in the end, Jafar is Jafar. It has the ability to just flat win games when your opponent can't answer it. So there's a lot of that interesting things going on as well. I think the best version of this deck is probably more of an Amethyst steel control deck that just has Jafar as a secondary win condition. But, cards like Robin Hood, cards like Jim Hawkins, they're very difficult to deal with on turn 3. So once you have a 5/5 in play or a 3/6 in play, they can definitely dominate the board for a few turns, and it's noticeable. So you don't necessarily need this, Jafar wheel win con as all or nothing. I think the deck is really starting to say, hey, I can do all these things and kind of still be successful. So I wouldn't mind seeing this list maybe get away from 4 Jafar, maybe just playing 2 of them. Maybe you don't even need 4 wheels, even though the list is obviously very good at shifting on turn 3 and getting ahead. But you also, if we kind of just compare this to Sapphire Steel, in most cases, that deck is always at a verse one another of saying, is it wheel? Is it not wheel? But what it does, it always has the control of drawing cards. It has the choice of saying, hey, I don't need to wheel if you're going to commit too much to my wheel. So I'm just going to play high to rim, draw my cards, yada, yada, yada. This is kind of the same thing. Like this has Blue Fairy that can consistently, you look at this list, you see 4 Jafar, 4 more Jafar, 4 rigging specialists, 4 Robin Hood, and 4 Aladdin. That's a lot of Floodborn characters that trigger off Blue Fairy. So that's a pretty interesting way to like go through the game and really control the game. And you get to decide if you want to wheel. And in most cases, you might only want to wheel if you have a Jafar in play. So pretty notable. Definitely other options I think that you could play with this list. You could also go to the fact of playing like Zimba Future King. So you can play it, pitch your extra whole new worlds and things like that. Doc is always an option as well. And of course, you also have the new Shift Zimba as well. The steel one that you can kind of shift in. I think he banishes locations or items on play as well. So definitely some options here if you really want to play with the Jafar style list. I do think it's a deck that honestly not everyone always ever respects. And sometimes you could really just mess with your opponent and play 2-cost Jafar and 4-cost Jafar, and they might even think that you are on big Jafar. You might not even need it. So lots of options around that, but I do think it's cool. It's definitely an off-meta deck that people will not be expecting to see at set championships. Emerald Steel. So I know, right? This is one of the most popular decks in Disney Lorcana. It won several Disney Lorcana challenges. How could it ever be off-meta? Well, it can be off-meta because in the current metagame, over the last 2 months of Azurite Sea, it's not been that successful. It's only really been successful in the hands of a limited amount of players. I do think the deck is very high rolly, but hey, listen, if you haven't really played since last set championships and you just played Emerald Steel last set championships, I'm here to tell you that the deck is still fine. It is not as broken as it was before. It isn't as just like free. You can't just simply rely on Diablo and Ursula to freely win games. You can't even really rely on a card like Pridgeshan to freely win games. But cards like the Muses are very effective cards in the metagame. In all honesty, most Amethyst decks have no way to interact with the Muse. Not that I want to just play 4 for a character that I feel like you mostly can't ever turn sideways until you're absolutely certain you're winning the game. But it is one of those cards that once it's in play, it has immediate impact. As long as you have a 2-cost character or a 3-cost character in play, you can sing Sudden Chill. You can sing Let the Storm Rage on, I'm Still Here, or Strength of a Raging Fire, and immediately turn on the Muses. So the moment you play it, You can be okay, I'm going to play it. I'm going to sing with my Ursula 2, make you sudden chill, discard a card, and then I'm going to bounce a card back to your hand. And all of a sudden, the board has just been flipped. And now your 3-cost character, like Prince John or like Ursula, have a little bit more freedom. Of course, if we have Ursula, we're probably singing with Ursula, and we can clear the board even more. So the deck is, I kind of compared the deck to like a snowball deck right now. I feel like a lot of the times you are kind of climbing uphill and just trying to get to a point in the game where you just snowball down and your opponent can't catch up with you. That's what the deck does feel like, but it hasn't really changed the play style. So if Emerald Steel is what you played last season and you don't really have time to learn another deck, I'm here to tell you that you can still play this deck as long as you understand how your deck plays, how your deck functions, and you're good at reactionary things. I think the deck will still be successful, and I think it's a fine deck for a choice for set championships. So, of course, as we're preparing for set championships, I need to shout out the Metafy. Obviously, the last couple weeks have been very, very adamant and just like tight to the chest with NACC coming up. The team has 3 members qualified for NACC that are all very much, gun-ho, looking to be successful. And we have 5 members of the team looking to LCQ. So, a little bit tighter with information, not as public as, I won a tournament over the weekend. I didn't even post the deck list or anything like that. It's just things like that of like understanding what the team is. But once we're past NACC, once we're past how tight knit it has to really be around a tournament to this, we're going to have the Metafy coming out for set championships. I actually have several videos recorded that's going to get released after set championships onto the Metafy, into the climb tier. I did a live coaching session with someone that's going to LCQ. They let me record that. That's going to be on the Metafy. Shout out to Jorge. You're the best. And I just want to let you guys know, like, hey, if you're looking for quick information, definitely written content. It's going to be a ton of it after NACC. There's already some on there. I think last week I wrote a little article about the meta from week 7 because I didn't record a Metafy video. I'm sorry, I didn't record a meta report that week. I just recorded a little written article for myself so I could kind of just still support and move forward. But next week, we're going to be dropping all of our deck lists that we decided that we almost played at NACC. You might even get some of those before leading up to it that we kind of removed from the process, but still think they are very viable decks. Nonetheless, if you're not yet, please just go hit follow on the Metafy. There's plenty of free content that goes on there, and you'll also get a bit of an understanding of how much more effort that goes into that, what the work is, some of the new guides coming out. There are 2 new guides coming out very, very shortly. Most likely by the end of the month, if not early February. So you're going to want to be there for all that. So again, just go hit follow because you never know what awesome free content you might find on there. This one could be my favorite of the bunch. Emerald Sapphire is a deck that's just never really been successful in Disney Lorcana, but finding a way into a top 8 of a 49-player tournament is pretty sweet. And if we really look at this deck list, I believe the entire brunt of this is a bend to my will deck, which is a pretty sweet, this card is 7 costs on Inkable, and it simply reads, your opponent discards their whole hand. That's pretty great. It's definitely a nice way to like just stop your opponent in their tracks, put them on hellbent status, make them play off the top of their deck. But the way this deck works is that it really triggers off of a card like Clarabelle, to where you're starting the whole game, setting up this line where you get to bounce all of your opponent's cards to their hand, trigger a big draw with Clarabelle, slowly let them get back into the game, and then bounce cards back to their hand and bend to my will, removing all of their threats from the game. The one thing I will say about this deck that does shock me a little bit is I am definitely shocked that there's no Under the Sea. I think as a safety net, I know there's a lot of uninkables in here. You probably have to make some decisions here. But Under the Sea feels like a great safety net to Bend to My Will. When Bend to My Will is not good, Under the Sea is probably phenomenal. So that's what I would look at it. Aside from that, this list looks like a lot of fun. Honestly, if you ask me a deck that I'm definitely going to try during set championships, it's this one. If I was going to League this week, I probably also would have played this deck. When I first looked at it, I'm like, wow, this deck is sweet, and I can't wait to play some games with it. For all I know, it might be meta defining. It could be. I don't have the experience to know for sure, but I definitely think this deck is interesting. It's good. So if you're the kind of player that just loves catching people off guard, loves playing creative and different things, and I just give the shout out here to Samurai. This deck looks awesome. It looks fun, and I absolutely can't wait to play it in set championships. Last but not least, shout out to Jack from the top 4 SSG 94 player tournament with Blurple. That's right. I said it. It's Blurple. Sapphire Amethyst has been a really fun deck that I've been playing over the weekend. For anyone that saw the picture, I did win a tournament with Sapphire Amethyst. Hades and Elsa, phenomenally fun cards to play in this deck. Sal the Azurite Sea is a card that is broken for every Sapphire deck, and Amethyst cards are really strong. This is another deck that before this weekend, I would say would probably not ever expect to sit across from it. Definitely before Azurite Sea is not a deck that has really ever had that much success. But in the Azurite Sea metagame, because of Sail the Azurite Sea and cards like Genie, very early on in the game, you're able to pressure the game pretty quickly. You're able to get ahead of your opponent. You're also able to feel pretty comfortable on your draw games when you can play a card like Sail the Azurite Sea, go up, still play an extra 1-drop, still be under the board, still compete, make cards like Crab a little bit better. It does a lot of things really, really well. And I think this is definitely a deck that if you enjoy Ruby Sapphire as a playstyle, you'll really like this. If you enjoy Ruby Amethyst as a playstyle, ironically, I think this is also a deck that you could really enjoy and have fun with. So if you're looking to do something different on a weekend, just try something out. This is a great deck to really pick up and try. It's a lot of fun, and it's really powerful. It's definitely a deck that is a contender in the metagame. It's very likely one of the underrated decks in the metagame. I'm not 100% sure I would say that it's a tier 1 deck by any means, but it's very close to tier 2 or like tier 1.5 in my humble opinion. It's not like straightforward, easy to pick up and play, but if you are a Ruby Amethyst player or you're just like an Amethyst player in general, then you understand kind of the core concept of that. And for Sapphire, no, this isn't a high rim deck, so it's not like duh, but if you just like ramping cards and playing big stuff like Hades and of course like Elsa's Spirit of Winter, then you're going to understand the gist of how you can play it. Obviously, a little more reactionary. Doesn't have a card like Be Prepared, so it has a little bit of worry of going wide boards, but you do have, the way to repeatedly play Elsa, both Elsas for that matter, with snakes, with foxes and things like that. I wouldn't even be shocked if a card like Elephant made an appearance in this list. Big body gives another bounce to the deck. So definitely a lot of things you can do with this. It's a really, really fun deck to play. I think it's really interesting. Again, if we're looking for off-meta choices, this is probably closest to the most successful one and the most likely to be really competitive. I think any of these decks in this video, you could argue can make a top 8 and you can, pick up a Scar for sure. I would say that Blurple has the biggest chance of winning the tournament. Emerald Steel also on any given day, if you're high rolling, turn 2 Diablo is still one of the best things you can do in the game. And when you do it, your opponent is definitely going to be behind for a few turns. Specifically, if they're not Sail the Azurite Sea and they don't have a turn 3 Genie or a turn 4 Elsa, you're able to keep them off those cards because of cards like Muses. So you can definitely slow them down and kind of keep moving your game forward. So Emerald Steel, probably a really good contention for set championships. Still just does all the right things. Sapphire Amethyst, still really powerful, really great on the draw deck. But these other lists that we talked about today are very interesting. They're different. And your opponent simply shouldn't be expecting to play against them. Right now, we're expecting to see Ruby Amethyst and Amber Steel and Ruby Sapphire and mostly, Amethyst Steel and things like that. Those are the decks that people are going in expecting seeing, in aggro or mid-range or even some control versions of all of those decks. Whereas these 5 decks are definitely under the radar. They haven't been accessible. They haven't been played in bunches. So even at the best, you might be able to catch opponents off guard because they're not really sure how to play the matchup. And you can kind of pick up free wins just based on that. All in all, I think all these decks are really cool. They're definitely, good decks. They've already seen success from other players within the community. So because of that, that's why I figured, hey, let's put them together. Let's tell you guys, like, these are the lists that I expect you could win a Scar with. You can top 8 with. You might even be able to win the whole tournament, pick up your playmat and all those things like that. So if you're like me, you like to be creative, you like to do something different. During set championships, I really don't ever like playing the same deck twice. I like going in. I like kind of educating myself on the different decks within Disney Lorcana so I can come back, talk about them a little bit more freely here, a little bit more better understanding of the decks. But this go around for the Scars, and honestly, just no DLC in sight after this weekend. I'm going to be looking to play the spiciest decks there are. So if you got something spicy, you feel good about it, hit me up in the comments and let me see it, because there's a good chance that I'll play it. If I don't play it in set championships, I'll probably play it in League for sure. We got a long couple months before set 7 hits, so there's a lot of time between this set championships and that. I mean, we're talking at the date of recording, 2 whole months still before set 7 comes out. There's a lot of time to still explore some of the more fun stuff within Azerite Sea. Thank you guys so much for watching today. I hope you guys found an off meta deck that you were looking for. Again, if you got something cool that I missed, hit me up in the comments. Let me know. If you enjoy videos like this, hit that like button for me. Let me know in the comments if you like to see more stuff like this. It's definitely not norm for the channel, but I'm looking to do some creative content in 2025. And this was an idea of like, hey, if you like this stuff, support it. Let me know. Hit the like button. Of course, if you're new here, you haven't yet, we do all sorts of stuff like this on a given basis. So definitely hit subscribe, and I will catch you guys in the next video.